Okay, today I'm going to try and do as much as I can on the rear axle and pinion, and then start looking at assembling the front hubs as well. One thing I discovered looking in the parts books and some articles is the thing that holds these carriers in place isn't bolts, it's actually studs. So these caps are also handed because they're threaded. You can see the thread on there, and there's a matching thread on the inside, which might be a bit hard to see. And these adjusters are threaded. And so the idea being, with these clamped in place, you can rotate these to adjust the positioning of the crown wheel left and right. And the pinion screws in and out of the torque tube to adjust the forwards and backwards. So I went back to the parts car and pulled out the studs and the special nuts. These are little locking set screws that go in the middle of those clamps. They're a bit mangled up, so I may need to make new ones of those. But the idea with them is they screw into there, and then once you've made the adjustments, I guess you can lock them in place. Although there aren't too many holes on that. So I'm not sure if that means you're supposed to figure out the correct adjustment and then drill through these, put a little dimple in this to give the screws something to lock into. That kind of looks like what's been done in the past. So I'll have to work out what the story is with that. Somebody's just used a normal bolt on one side, but I think it's supposed to have a little non-threaded tip on it, probably to lock into there, or a conical tip, something like that. So that'll be something to sort out. I'm just going to clean these up, and then I'll put them into the axle I'm using. And I've started looking at assembling the pinion gear. So I've already got a bearing set for it. I bought a whole bunch of bearings pretty early on. These are the bearings that go in the differential end, and I think these are the ones that go at the hub ends for the rear axle. So I've got a set of those. This is a pinion I've got that hasn't been disassembled. Obviously there's no guarantee that it's last time it was assembled it was correct, but it's the best I've got to go on. And the parts books, it's a bit tricky to tell, and the manual we've got has a picture, but it's kind of it's not exactly an exploded diagram, it's just a picture of various parts without showing how they go together. But I believe it's something like this. This is the housing, this thrust bearing, that is a tight fit in there, and then you have that. And then this one seems to be, on the set I've got, it's a roller bearing, whereas all the others I've got are actually ball bearings. So I'm assuming that's fine to use. One of the things you always have to be careful about with these rollers is they will come apart. So I'm not sure. I think that means, I can get it back together. Of course, everything's very tight tolerances. I'm trying to keep it all clean, hence it being on this old towel. There we go. If you look at the housing, it's a bit hard to see. You might just be able to see the pattern where the old bearing was. It doesn't come hard up against the step inside here, because this bearing actually sits up a bit higher. So the inside of this is touching that, which will set the outer position. The ring just fell off again. So what I was trying to figure out is which way round in the housing does this need to go. Stuck again. These things are such good tolerances. When you try to assemble them, if you get any misalignment, they just kind of jam up. It's not really jammed up, but they just sort of slide in and then stick. So I'll sort that out in a minute. So this bearing is this one. So does that mean I would need to fit it in that way round so that when this is all clamped together, this housing isn't going to move? Because otherwise I don't understand what stops the outer race. If it's this way round, there's nothing really holding this in here. These have been punched in the past to keep it in place, but you can see there's not really anything holding it there. So if you have it this way round, there's nothing keeping the outer race in place, whereas if it goes that way round, when this is all bolted together, it can't move, because it can't move off the bearing this side because it's stepped here. So I need to figure out what the story is there. And then on the other side, there's another thrust bearing, and this one just seems to be a loose fit in there. It's not a tight fit up against the housing. I'm not sure how this one is. I'm pretty sure that's how this one is as well, because there's actually some wobble on this, you can see. And on the other one I took apart, there is also clearance around the housing. So I believe this goes in next. This is the two lock washers, that the lock nuts that go on there, and there's a star-shaped washer that goes in between these two that has a tang on it to fit into this, and then it has little tabs that you bend over to lock onto that. You can just see the remains of one in there. So I think I'm just going to have to hand make that, or else get it plasma cut. But that's a one-off, so that's not too difficult. And then you've got this bearing on the outside. Goes in here, and then the muff coupler slides onto here. There's a set screw that holds it, and I believe there's a spring ring as well. So I've got the new muff coupler is coming from the UK, so hopefully that'll be here soon. And then there's the special stepped washer. I didn't order this from the spares because I wasn't sure where it goes, and it turns out I actually had one on my bearing set. It came with them, but I don't know where that goes. I'm thinking, obviously it goes on the pinion because it's keyed to fit on there, but what I'm thinking is that probably goes between here and the bearing and this outer bearing. So it would sort of be like that, so that the pressure is on the inner part of the bearing. I'm not entirely certain, but I think that must be the order that it all goes. So the other thing that's a bit confusing is I've got a second one of these bearings, and I have no idea where that goes. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I was only supposed to get one of those. It came as a kit, so presumably that means that is used somewhere, but I'm not exactly sure where. On the other pinion I took apart, it didn't have the special stepped washer, but it did have a washer there, sort of just a plain flat washer. So I wonder if somebody didn't have one of these and they just used a plain washer in there. But yes, it's interesting. I think that is probably how that goes. So that pushes on there, because that is the right sort of diameter for that. The only other place it would go, I guess, would be here, but it seems more likely it would go there. So that's going to be fun, figuring that out. I decided to take apart this one just to see how this is assembled, the order of it. So Got the muff coupler off, that wasn't too hard. Pressed out the bearing in the little press there, which is an incredibly useful tool. You don't realize how useful they are until you need to start doing jobs like this, pushing things in and out of housings and getting bearings off and that kind of thing. I've removed the first of the little lock nuts with the little C-spanner there, and you can see the mangled remains off that special star washer that's in there. That's obviously very, very mangled. And this one just seems to come undone by hand. Luckily these things, if they've been in an axle, they're full of oil, of course, covered in oil, so they don't rust up too badly. The documentation I've got that explains about how you're supposed to do this says this needs to be done up. Basically, it needs to be done up so there's no movement, end-to-end movement in it, but it's not binding up. So you just kind of do it up fairly tight, I think. I'll keep taking this apart and we'll see what's in it. With the first lock washer slackened off, the rest of it came apart very easily. So that's the remains of the lock washer. That looks like it's been used a few times. And then there's the second lock nut, and then the smaller of the thrust bearings. And that is a loose fit in the housing. So you can see there's plenty of room around there. It's not like that's a tight press fit. Which I think is how thrust bearings like this normally are. They're because obviously they're taking the force forwards and backwards, not side to side. So they don't need like a tight fit around the outside of the bearing, I'm guessing. So I should be able to now press this out. Kind of depends how loose it is. Sometimes I just give things a whack with the copper brass hammer, and that might be enough to shake it loose, but I might as well pull this apart. But you can see there was no stepped washer in there, so I'm still none the wiser as to where that little washer needs to go. I had trouble getting the bearings out of the other housing. The pinion came out first, so now I have to try and get the bearings out of the housing. So I've got them sitting in the little toaster oven heating up, which will help. So in the meantime, I've started on the front end. I've bolted on the brake back plates. They use these special bolts with flats on them to clear the middle of the stub axle. Although interestingly, on the other side, this doesn't stick out quite as far. We're talking fractions of a millimetre, but there is a slight difference there. And the backing plates are of course handed, so you have to make sure you get them on the right side and the right way round. So this pin here is for the spring. So these are the brake cams that go through there, and yes, they are just stainless steel sleeves in the alloy backplate like that. So I'm not sure if wear in there can be a problem. I'm assuming it would be, but these don't seem too bad. I have heard of people sleeving these, but that all seems a little bit complicated. So I'll put it together how it is and then see how the brakes are when I'm done. But I just want to get the wheels all up and on there. Those sleeves are kind of pressed on there, so you can't easily get those off. I made that mistake once before, so if I need to, I do actually have a set of these where I'd taken that sleeve off, so I could always reuse those and remachine, like press on a new sleeve and then machine it to be a nice fit in the back plate. I have heard of people putting in bronze bushes in there, I think, but it's good enough that I can actually get the wheels on it. There's just 4 nuts on the back holding that all in place, and pretty much everything on this car I assemble by hand. So a lot of the time you're watching these YouTube videos, especially the American ones, and they they just go at everything with rattle guns, and it just zap things up. God knows how much torque's going on anything. With something like this, I figure stick to the original ways and tools and methods. So I just use period correct spanners. The theory being the length of the spanner sort of gives you an idea of how much torque you're putting on it. So, you know, you can put a decent amount of pull on a small spanner like this, and that's probably going to be torqued up enough. With a rattle gun, who knows what sort of torque's on there. And of course there aren't any torque figures for any of this sort of stuff, so you just kind of, I guess you have to know what's appropriate based on the size of the fastener and what it's doing. But if I was like a professional mechanic and I was doing cars and things every day, I'd definitely use power tools just to save getting RSI and things like that. They definitely make it a lot easier and quicker. But something like this, where I'm hand assembling it, it makes sense just to use the old-fashioned ways. I've mentioned a few times the manual. So this is basically what I've got. This book, if you're into Riley's, it's a well-known book. S.V. Haddleton. The slightly annoying thing is it's not separate. It's separated into chapters on the part. So you can see this is rear axles, but it can be tricky figuring out where the change from the pre-war stuff to the post-war. So you can see all of a sudden it just changes. There's a heading there, and now you're looking at a much later car. And I find that's really annoying in this book. I'd rather have a book that was separated into a pre-war section, post-war, so that when you're working on a particular car, you've got all the information for that car in one place. With this book, you have to keep flipping around, depending on which system you're working on, to find the right thing. And more than once, I've been reading about something and then realized, oh, this isn't appropriate for a pre-war car. So, for example, that's pre-war stuff, pre-war handbrake. This is what I was talking about in terms of the diagram I've got showing what goes where. So you can see there isn't a lot of information. Basically, I've got this to go on. So it kind of shows you the parts, doesn't really show where they go. You can see there's no lock washer there, it doesn't mention it at all. Kind of goes a bit into the adjustment. This is the rear axle. These are the springs for the brake lever. It took me a while to figure out that the reason there are two springs on the back here, that always looked a bit funny to me, but you have to think it's a single cable that kind of loops around a pulley here and goes back to each front wheel, and each front wheel has got a single spring on it. So I'm guessing having two at the back here evens out the two on the front. This spring is the handbrake return lever spring, I think. So since that housing is now hot, I'll see if I can get that bearing out and just have a look at it. That's all back together again. The other reason I put it back together was just for the practice, so I know how to assemble the next one and the best way to do it, and to make sure that my tools and things were all going to work. So now that that's back together, I'll just spray it with some oil and put it back up on the spare parts shelf for now. Fitted the studs to the rear axle, and I've made sure that the bearing caps are the right way up. They actually have little marks on them already, but I figured it out and punched them so I don't get it confused. And I'm going to press the bearings into the housings. You have to be a little bit careful when you fit the housings under the clamps. Theoretically, they should be able to screw in from either direction, but what I've found is you actually have to have them positioned pretty much where they need to go for these to actually bolt up correctly. If you've got them screwed in or out too far, they don't really fit very well. And that may just be because they're old and they've been sitting in one position for 90 odd years. But as long as I do that, then everything goes together quite nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and put the bearings into the housings, but I'm doing my trick again with the little oven, just heating them up just to 100 degrees, and that should just make it a bit easier to press the bearings in rather than forcing them in. These are the bearings here. I've just given them a clean with some carb cleaner, brake cleaner, and then I'll re-oil them. These are the rear hub bearings. So these basically fit in there. They are sealed bearings, but I also have new backing plates for them with modern oil seals. So these will go into there, and that makes absolutely certain no oil can leak out, no grease can leak out, because otherwise, of course, it goes onto your brakes. But these being sealed bearings, I'm not sure that was really necessary now that I look at it, but it was easy enough to get those. I was also reading through the book, and the book does actually mention that some pinion carriers use a roller bearing, although my book's going to get covered in oil, but you can't help that. I'm pretty sure it mentions the taper roller races. So it talks about pressing this outer race in, and it does mention having the thicker end towards the pinion, which makes sense because then it can't come out. So I need to decide if I'm going to use the taper one or the good second-hand roller one. I'm not sure it's really going to make too much difference, but I'll ask on the forum and see what people think. I also want to press the wheel studs in today, and in the box of wheel studs I discovered something that I knew I had and couldn't find when I needed it, and that was the rear number plate lamp for the Austin 7. So I ended up buying a reproduction one, but now I've found the original one, which I knew I had, so I may swap that over at some point, but that's not really urgent. So I'll put this up here where I'm bound to forget that it is. So I'm just waiting for that heating to finish, and I'll press those outers in and start looking at the front hubs. These are the backing plates for the front hubs, and you can see they're not very thick. So I've gone with the original leather seals in there. This one seems a little bit off center, but that's how it arrived, so that's what I'm going to go with. I can't remember if the front bearings are also sealed bearings. I'm pretty sure they're actually sealed bearings, so again, this isn't quite as necessary as it used to be in the old days. So there are a few places I'll use modern stuff on an old car like this. Oil seals is a good one, bearings is a good one. You know, you might as well use modern bearings with modern grease, and you don't have to worry about them. And the other thing is Loctite. So obviously they didn't have Loctite back in the day. Things like these wheel studs, these get pressed into the hub. You can see there's a little locating pin so they can't rotate. And then originally what they did is they sort of peened these. They put a couple of punch marks, I think it's called staking, to lock the nut in place. But that damages both the stud and the nut, of course. So I think what I'm going to do is just torque them up, because you can torque these up really tight because they're pretty beefy, and use Loctite on them. And I looked at this up online a little bit to see what people do these days. I think Model T Ford people with the wheels they have do similar things, and people racing also just use Loctite on them. So I think that's going to be fine. Let's see. I'm not sure if I've got an original one. You can see the originals have those punch marks in them. Well, some of them don't look very accurate, to be honest. But I think the Loctite will be a much better solution. This is also one of the original rear back plates with the leather, the original leather seal. You can sort of see it in there. So I think the modern oil seal will be a lot nicer to use there. I think these should be just about cooked. I'm waiting for it to go ding, and then I'll press the bearings in. I hammered in the wheel studs. It wasn't too hard. I just used the brass hammer, which looks like I need to get a new one. This is a really rubbish hammer. I think the idea is that you can screw in replacement end pieces even though they're not threaded. They've just got sort of ribs on them to grip them. And the idea is you do up this hex screw to tighten it up. But it's just so cheap and nasty. You can see the housing's cracked there, so that's just going to come apart now. So I need a new brass and rubber hammer. But it wasn't too hard to tap these through. They're fairly tight, but not so tight that you need to use the press. I did use some Loctite, the bearing retaining compound, 638 I think it is, just on the inside of the stud where it actually goes into the housing, just to take up any small gaps there. And then I used a lot of the blue Loctite on the nuts, and I used the biggest breaker bar I've got to really torque these up. So these are done up pretty nice and tight now. I don't think they're actually going to come undone unless I want them to. And the heating up the diff carriers worked really well. It was really easy then just to push the bearings home. And you can see I've got these sort of, they're not tightened all the way up, but they should be at the point where with a suitable bar in there you can rotate these housings to shift the differential backwards and forwards. So that's another small job done. I think what I'm going to do is give these a paint touch up. I had to grip them in the vise pretty tightly to do up the nuts on the studs. So I'm gonna touch up the paint on these, I think, and also protect the nuts on the back from rusting. But the other thing to note with Riley 9 hubs like this is they're actually handed. So these ones on the right hand side of the car have a normal thread, right hand thread, and the ones on the left hand side of the car have a reverse thread, which does screw with your brain a little bit because you get so hardwired into thinking righty tighty, lefty loosey, but these are of course the opposite. So, and the way I always think about it, which side should be on which side of the car, is if you imagine the wheel is on here, this is going forwards, you've got the weight of the wheel. As you brake, the wheels are still trying to rotate that way while the hub is stopping, and it will turn the nuts that way, so they would self-tighten. I believe that's how it's supposed to work. There was an interesting discussion on a site, a forum I saw, about wheels with sort of racing wheels with a single spinner wheel nut, whether they are left hand or right hand thread on which side of the car, and apparently there's different ways of doing it. So this, I think they still do this on big trucks and buses and things like that, where the left hand side threads are reverse threaded so they don't undo, but normal cars of course you don't worry about that.